What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Transitions to Democracy. I hope that you had a wonderful weekend, that you enjoyed Labor Day. I'm very happy to be back with you tonight. We're going to deal with case study methods in democratization research today. So we're going to do this in a couple different ways. We will, first of all, learn some key research methods, but we're also going to step by step use those methods ourselves to actually analyze some data and take a look at some different patterns that emerge across cases of democratic transitions. And so we will learn the methods, but we'll use them as well. And we'll look at data and just carry out a full research process all in the space of this lecture. So as we get started, I just want to remind you that we are recording the lecture and that you can find this lecture online, linked through CAT courses. The recording, the video recording, as well as the lecture slides, which I also post under CAT courses as well. So I encourage you to use these materials and use them to review previous lectures, but also to touch up and kind of maybe draw comparisons with the reading. Just use the material however you want. And of course, it'll become relevant as well as we prepare for the exams later in the course. But all of that material is available to you. And I just want to encourage you to continue to use it because we need flexibility, and I want you to have all the access that you can have at this time. So let's get started today dealing with this question, how we should study democratic transitions methodologically. And our starting point is acknowledging that democratic transitions are incredibly complicated. The truth is that there may be few processes in politics and in comparative politics that are as complicated in terms of the number of actors involved, the levels of analysis, the various interests that intersect or conflict, all of the different actors at the different levels of analysis. Regime transitions like democratic transitions, economic transitions like transitions from capitalism to socialism or vice versa, these processes are really complex. They're difficult to model formally and they're difficult to test statistically. And it's because of these many actors and these path dependencies and these interactions between various variables and this intersection of all these different conditions and circumstances that characterize these processes. And what that means for us is that we have to limit ourselves to a certain number of variables, a certain number of actors, a certain number of levels of analysis that we can deal with and that we can deal with responsibly in the space of a brief 15 or 16 week course. And so we will focus on a narrower set of issues in a certain set of theories of democratic transitions. But what you'll see is that throughout, we really focus on one core problem in this course. And in democratization research more broadly, we focus on really one core problem. And that core problem is, why do some attempted regime transitions generate effective and successful democratic states which last many decades while other autocracies remain unreformed and persist unreformed? This is a question about democratic transitions and why some countries transition and why others don't. This is the core problem in democratic transition research. This is what we want to understand. And so as we narrow our focus to a set of problems and a set of theories that is manageable, this is going to be our main emphasis and our main focus. And you know already that there's a lot of variation in the world when it comes to these processes. And so this is what we focus on from here on out. But even in focusing on this narrower set of questions that relate to regime transitions, we still face the problem of how to approach that issue methodologically. So even if we choose to focus on a certain set of theories, a certain set of potential hypotheses, a certain set of actors, we still have to approach these issues in a way that is systematic, in a way that is orderly, and that follows a series of steps that we can follow and carry out in any research process. This is the problem that we face, and this is a methodological problem. It is a problem that relates to how we go about attempting to systematically understand different transition processes. And this methodological problem is the problem that we address today. We're addressing the question of how to approach these transitions in a way that is systematic and is consistent and is methodological. And our first method for doing so is the simplest method, but maybe the most important of all. And this is the method of asking questions. We ask questions to try to understand different patterns that emerge across cases. And we ask questions that highlight puzzles or sets of similarities and differences in the world that are illuminating or make us question what's going on. And in particular, we use two approaches to asking and answering research questions. The first approach we call a most similar systems design. And this is where we choose two or more cases that have similar characteristics, but different outcomes. And so maybe they have similar social, economic, and political and historical features, but one country transitioned to democracy and one country did not. That's an example of a most similar systems design. We also have what we call a most different systems design. And this is where two or more cases with different characteristics but similar outcomes are put together and are compared. This is kind of the flip side of the most similar systems design. Here's where we have cases that are very different socially or historically or politically or economically, but have similar outcomes. So maybe two countries with very different backgrounds, but both of which transition to democracy. These types of puzzles, or these sets of most similar and most different cases, constitute the puzzles that lead to the research questions that we ask in democratization research. And so let's give us some examples and take a look at what we mean in practice. Let's take the example of South Korea. Now, the example of South Korea is interesting because this is a country that transitioned to democracy under very difficult circumstances. State-society relations had been forged under military rule in South Korea, and the opposition to military rule was divided, meaning that there actually wasn't a balance of forces that made it likely that the democratic forces would succeed in bringing about a transition. But nevertheless, in 1987, South Korea transitioned and did so in a way that brought about a system that would persist for many decades. And so the question is, what caused this transition? What caused this very unlikely event? Looking at South Korea alone is not sufficient to understand this transition. It's not enough for us just to look at South Korea if we want to understand why South Korea transitioned to democracy. Now that might seem counterintuitive to you. It might seem like, well, don't we just need to study South Korea to understand South Korea? But there's more to it than this. And I want to pause here and step back for a moment. And I want to ask you, why looking at South Korea by itself is insufficient to understand South Korea's democratic transition? Why is it that just looking at South Korea is not enough? Let's pause and step back and tell us in the chat, and I'll incorporate your input as we go along. Maria says, we need to study the different relationships they have with other countries that affect the democratization. Okay, so that's a possibility. Studying South Korea alone might not illuminate those other relationships. Joel says, can't isolate variables of true democratization in that situation. Interesting, Joel. So I wonder, do you mean to say that we're not able to see the different values on the key variables if we only have one case? Do you mean that we don't have control over the key variation that we need to observe? Can you tell us a little more? I think you're really onto something there. Daisy says, because of the history with North Korea and the divide of the country. Interesting, Daisy. So it could be that there's some important contrast or set of patterns that might emerge if we examine South and North Korea, and that maybe we need to take a look at those patterns. Juan says, well, I think that we should also take into account what was happening in its surrounding that led them to make the bold decision to democratize. Okay, Juan, so it's possible that maybe we should look more broadly at the situation and see if there's something going on around South Korea that could have been important. Ishan says, because there may be factors that are causing the democratic change that could be miscategorized within the country. Ishan, do you think that examining other countries alongside South Korea might help to highlight if there are factors that don't align or that might cause us to reevaluate our assessment of the case? What do you think studying other countries would help us do that we could not do studying South Korea by itself? Italia says, a country doesn't transition overnight. They are influenced by other factors, whether it be in their own country or their allies. There's too many differing factors as to why a country would become a democracy, so you have to look at multiple different scenarios. Okay. So it's possible that we're not able to see all the factors if we study a single case. Maybe we need to study more cases to see if there are spurious relationships or other factors that would discount maybe our original assessment of just that single case. Jose says, it does not account for external influence, be it cultural, economic, or anything else. Okay, so again, there may be some external forces or some set of factors that lie outside of the single case that we wouldn't see examining the case by itself. Samantha says, we need to look at the whole picture, which includes North Korea, the US, and Japan, plus many more. Democracies take time. We need to see what cultural and economic relationships there are. Okay, good. So taking a look at the bigger picture, maybe thinking about the process more holistically. Daniela says, there were a lot of factors coming into play for any country that transitions to democracy and often are forced by either other nations to transition. Often when it is done too fast, things can go awry and other aspects of the nation, economics, or culture might not be transitioning as fast as the rest of the country is. Okay, so again, there may be other factors that we don't pick up on just examining that single case. Good. Giovanni says, maybe because of external influences from other democracies or an attempt to stray from the North Korean autocratic governmental model. Okay. Ishan says, yes, because this allows you to see which parts of the democratic transition are successful within other countries. So Ishan, picking up on that question, does examining other countries permit us to see factors that studying South Korea by itself does not let us see? Good, Ishan, addressing that question. I think it's accurate that studying other cases might bring into focus a set of factors that we wouldn't see just looking at South Korea. Daniela Foster says, there's a lot of peer pressure in a way that can lead to democratization, and with some countries highly promoting it and others being highly against it, it could also greatly impact a country in the midst of a transition such as South Korea. Okay. Ishan says, like how we saw last week, how there were factors that were present in Venezuela that weren't in other countries in the study, so they couldn't be the reasons for the transition. Good, Ishan, good. This is an important example of how examining other countries can show us what we are not seeing in that original case. Yohel says, South Korea is probably an exception, especially in their relations. They had a war with the northern side, each backed by totally different world powers, north to the former USSR and south to the US. This being said, perhaps the two had a say in shaping the domestic policies of the two Koreas. Interesting, Yohel. This is a historical part of the story that is absolutely essential. The experience with World War II and the post-World War II departure that those two countries took, along with their ideological commitments to those different sides that were brought into conflict during the Cold War. And so the World War II context and the post-war context are really important because it's that context that shows us that these countries departed from each other at a certain point in time, and that maybe there was something going on that influenced those outcomes and helps us to explain the divergence between the two cases. Joel says, variables are not controlled. We must be able to understand what created the biggest shifts in power. If another nation is unable to transition in a similar situation, then there is a fundamental difference between the two cases. Good, Joel, good. So what we're picking up on is that examining a single case doesn't let us see the potential for other cases to go different ways despite the presence of the same circumstances. We have to observe variation in the values on the variables, and we have to see that the direction of causation is in the expected direction, right? That the presence of something causes something to happen, and that the absence of something doesn't cause it to happen. If we examine multiple cases and find out that that's not true, it turns out that examining a single case would have been a misleading test or analysis. And so it does become important for us to examine multiple cases. Martin says, looking at the circumstances as to what happened before can also help determine why, such as the Korean War, the influences and the motives of why it had transitioned when it did and not sooner. It is to acknowledge that democracy doesn't happen in a vacuum. Okay, good, Martin. So as we've established, we can't examine South Korea by itself because there's no control and there's no variation in the key variables. And we can't know, for example, if the absence of what caused democratization in South Korea did not cause democratization in some other case. We can't know that. But we can examine patterns that exist in the real world to begin to try to get that same leverage. And so, for example, North Korea did not democratize. Many of you pointed out that North Korea did not democratize, though South Korea did. That is a crucially important departure or difference between these two cases. This is something that is probably systematic because they went in such radically different directions. And we want to understand, why is it that South Korea transitioned and North Korea did not? And we want to ask questions so that we can understand these kinds of patterns of similarity and difference. And so we ask, why did South Korea democratize while North Korea did not? This is an example of a most similar systems design because we have two similar cases with different outcomes. The outcome being democratic transition, South Korea transitioning, North Korea not. These are the kinds of patterns that we learn from and that we examine systematically to try to understand why countries transition and why they do not. Now, let's take a look at another example that is in Africa and is also a useful way for us to take a look at the need for comparison. So in Africa, West Africa to be specific, you'll find the country of Benin. Benin is a poor multi-ethnic society. It's a former French colony that wrestles with the legacies of colonial rule. Benin gained independence in 1960 and briefly was a fragile parliamentary democracy, but soon descended into military dictatorship. Still, 30 years later, in the 1990s, the country transitioned to democracy. And in the next 20 years, the country had numerous free and fair elections and peaceful transfers of power, all following one after the other. Now, this is a successful transition to democracy by any standard. Benin, not only the first democracy in West Africa, but one of the most stable. Until, of course, very recently, but that's a separate discussion that we'll deal with later. For our purposes now, Benin stands out as a poster child for African democratization in the early post-independence period. But the truth is that looking at Benin alone is really insufficient to understand this democratic transition, in the same way that looking at South Korea is insufficient to understand South Korea's transition. The reason is because even if we can attribute the transition in Benin to some particular cause, we don't know that the absence of that variable would have resulted in the persistence of the authoritarian regime, because we don't have that variation on the key variables. We don't have a way for us to examine those changes in those variables and see if the variation produces the expected outcomes. Just like with South Korea, looking at Benin alone is not enough to understand the case of Benin. We need to look at some other case. Now, that other case is Togo. Togo is also a West African country that is a poor, multi-ethnic former French colony. But Togo did not democratize. Whereas Benin transitioned successfully, Togo did not. But the story is otherwise very similar. Like Benin, Togo won independence in 1960, but then fell to military rule after a brief stint as a fragile parliamentary democracy. Now, in subsequent decades, Benin re-democratized, but Togo did not. Togo remained a military-backed autocracy, and a corrupt one at that. And so a pattern emerges across these cases, and that pattern is, why did Benin democratize while Togo did not? This is a very simple pattern, but it's an intuitive one because we've got two very similar cases that went different ways. And yet again, this is an example of a most similar systems design because we have similar countries with different outcomes. And this simple research design allows us to examine systematically variation in key variables of interest and to see if variation in those variables of interest produce the different outcomes across the similar cases. So like with South Korea and North Korea, Benin and Togo provide us with a useful foil for studying a transition in a systematic way. Now, when we have these questions that emerge from patterns of similarities and differences, we then begin thinking about different hypotheses that can explain the variation that we observe, and they could answer those research questions that come out of those puzzles that emerge from those patterns of similarity and difference. A hypothesis is an argument that links cause to effect, and the independent variables are the causes, and the dependent variables are the effects. And in the social sciences, we use these terms, independent and dependent variables, to distinguish these parts of hypotheses. When we form hypotheses, we need to make sure that our hypotheses have two important characteristics, because otherwise they're not hypotheses. And those characteristics are that they must be causal, that is, they must imply a causal relationship between two things, two or more things, and they must be testable and falsifiable. That is to say, we must be able to examine them empirically and confirm or falsify them empirically by examining data and evaluating data against the theoretical expectations that come from the hypotheses. So when we create these hypotheses, we create them fundamentally to test ideas about what causes the transitions that we aspire to explain. And so let's take a look at some different examples of hypotheses that purport to explain democratic transitions. One hypothesis focuses on economic development and says that economic development causes democratization. Democratization will take place after a country reaches a certain level of economic development, is basically the argument, basically the hypothesis. That's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that power sharing can facilitate a democratic transition in a divided society. This is the hypothesis that institutions that share power between multiple ethnic groups will help to facilitate a democratic transition in deeply divided societies. That is, societies where lots of different groups exist and may be in conflict with one another or in tension with one another over the fate of the country. And so in Sri Lanka, for example, power sharing has been a feature of the democratic regime. And some hypotheses hypothesize that power sharing helps to cause democratization in divided societies. So these are two examples of testable, falsifiable hypotheses. Is it true that more developed countries are more likely to become democratic? Is it true that less developed countries are less likely to become democratic? Is it true that power sharing constitutions make it more likely that divided societies will transition to democracy? Is it true that the absence of power sharing constitutions will prevent societies from transitioning to democracy if they are divided societies? These are all testable, falsifiable claims, falsifiable, testable hypotheses about what causes democratic transitions. I'm going to take a look at the chat because there's a question, I believe. How can you falsify economic development causes democratization? Well, you can find out is it true that more developed countries are more likely to be democratic? Or is it not true that more developed countries are more likely to be democratic? Are there lots of less developed countries that are democratic? Are there lots of very developed countries that are not democratic? So we can examine and compare levels of development with levels of democracy and find out if they tend to correspond. So we can falsify that. Ishan says, you look at countries that developed economically that are similar to countries that are also developed and see whether they cause democratic transitions. The example is China and South Korea and Southeast Asia. Yeah, Ishan, that's an example of what you can do. And you can look at like earlier periods of time when China was less developed, like the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, when South Korea was more developed, and you can take a look at whether or not the regime outcomes went the way you expected. You could do other comparisons too. But the point is that there are ways of falsifying these hypotheses, and there are ways of testing them by just simply comparing the levels in the categories of certain countries across the different variables of interest. So we've got then research questions. We've got hypotheses that purport to explain the variations that we observe and that help to answer our questions. Once we have those hypotheses, we use different methods of testing those hypotheses. And those methods are the method of difference and the method of agreement. Now, we're going to use these methods step by step here momentarily to actually test the hypotheses that we just came up with just a second ago. And we'll use these methods to examine data and to evaluate those hypotheses in the data. The method of difference, our first method, works alongside most similar systems designs. It's compatible with that type of design. And this method is the comparison and the contrasting of cases with the same attributes, but different outcomes. And you look for clues as to why the cases differ. So you take countries with the same attributes, but different outcomes, and you try to figure out what is it that differentiates those two similar countries. The method of agreement is really the reverse, and it works with the most different systems designs. This method involves comparing and contrasting cases with different attributes, but similar outcomes. And you're looking specifically for clues as to why the cases are similar. So we're comparing and contrasting different cases to try to figure out what unifies those similar cases and can help to explain their similar outcomes. Now, these are two methods for evaluating and analyzing data and testing our hypotheses. We're going to use these methods step by step to evaluate actual data in the rest of this lecture. And I'm going to incorporate your input, and I'm going to have you work with me to evaluate some of the data that I present you with so that I can confirm that we are using these approaches effectively and that we know how they work. So let's set out on this analysis. And let's begin by taking a look at the steps involved in using the method of difference. Now, the method of difference, as a reminder, involves comparing similar cases to figure out what accounts for their different outcomes. So we begin with sets of very similar cases where the outcome of interest varies. And these similarities can be social, political, economic, historical, geographic, etc. The similarity is often going to be linked to geographical proximity, but it need not be by definition. There can be two similar countries that are not linked geographically, although geography often is a unifying factor. Now, once we identify these similarities in this outcome of interest that varies, we are trying to identify in what regard these similar countries differ. And then we use that as the key factor that explains the variation in the outcome. We're honing in on the factor that differentiates these similar cases. That's why we call it the method of difference. And that key factor that differentiates the cases is what explains variation in the outcome. And this process then can be used to differentiate those similar cases and explain the variation that we observe. So let's take a look at an example and use our example of Benin. And we'll use this as an example of explaining democratization. Our outcome of interest, as a reminder, is democratic transition. And we have two cases. We have the cases of Benin and Togo, two West African countries that are both former French colonies with similar colonial legacies, both poor, ethnically and religiously divided societies. We're using the method of difference to try to figure out what circumstance or condition differentiates these cases and helps to explain their varying outcomes along the democratic transition variable. And so we focus on 5 characteristics of a country. We've got 5 variables here. We've got first, French colonial legacy. We've got poverty, geography, power sharing constitution, and ethnic diversity. And our hypothesis, as we begin to analyze this data, our hypothesis is power sharing and its impact on democratization. This goes back to our example that I gave you a moment ago. Let's formalize this hypothesis and elaborate the 2 sides of this hypothesis so that you can see what this looks like formally when we actually elaborate the hypothesis. So, if it is true that power sharing causes democratization, it should be the case that in divided societies which adopt power sharing constitutions, attempted democratic transitions will succeed in generating effective democratic states that persist over many decades. Put more simply, in divided societies that adopt power sharing, democratic transitions will succeed. The second hypothesis, the other half of the coin, is that in divided societies that do not adopt power sharing, autocratic regimes will persist unreformed. Now we could put that a different way slightly and say that in divided societies which adopt power concentrating constitutions, because that's the opposite of power sharing, autocratic regimes will persist unreformed. To put it a different way, in divided societies that adopt power concentrating institutions, democratic transitions will fail. These are testable, falsifiable hypotheses about the role of power sharing institutions. These hypotheses imply very observable implications. Is it true that power sharing constitutions cause successful transitions? Is it true that power concentrating constitutions cause the failure of democratic transitions and the persistence of unreformed autocracies? We can actually examine the world and examine real data to find out if these hypotheses are borne out in the data. And this is what we're going to do right now. And this is what we'll do a few more times before this lecture is over. But I want to put it to you, and I want to pause and step back. And I want to present the data to you in this way, in the form of a table where we have our 2 cases, Benin and Togo, and we have each variable. Each variable has a column, and each column has the value along that variable for the specific case. And I want you to examine this data using the method of difference involving comparing similar cases. And I want you to try to figure out in what ways do these cases differ? And then what descriptive and causal inferences can we draw from the data based upon the patterns that do or do not emerge in this data across these similar cases? And so I'm going to step back and I'm going to put it to you. And I want you to use the chat to provide your input. You may choose to message me privately if you don't want anyone to see your response, or you can message the class. But I'd like to hear from as many students as possible. And I think that this can be a good exercise in getting started using comparative methods to evaluate data and to test hypotheses. And so I'm going to pause here and use the chat to let us know what your answers are. I'm happy to report that we're picking up the same insight and that we're generally on the same page. John says the differences between power sharing constitution and democratic transition, but I don't think it's possible to determine any causal inference with just two countries used as data. There could also be many other differences that aren't shown. John, it's absolutely right that it's a small sample with only two cases and that there could be many other factors that would appear in other cases. But speaking strictly based on this data and drawing inferences from what we have here, there are inferences that we can draw. Now, the strength of those inferences and the validity of them based on the sample size is a separate question. But we can draw inferences from this data using the method. And in a comparative research process, that would be part of the process, even if it's a small sample size. And so let's try to think along the lines of the method and what we can use it for, even with its limitations. Gustavo says, based off the data, it is very crucial that a power sharing constitution is critical when transforming to democracy so that the transition has longevity. Juan says, I think that the only way that they differ is on the power sharing constitution. This is because they most likely had a reform that allowed one person to obtain power. Therefore, there was no distribution and it would then be considered an authoritarian regime. And that's something that they were trying to evolve and move on from. Joel says, in a comparison between Togo and Benin, it seems because Benin did have a power sharing constitution that it led to a democratic transition. Okay, so we're picking up again on that key difference. Daniela says, considering the only difference in these two cases was the power sharing constitution, it could be inferred that the power sharing constitution can greatly aid with democratic transitions in countries with divided ethnic diversity. There are other factors that are not listed with the case, however, that could also have an impact. Without a doubt, Daniela, there could be other factors as well. And one of the advantages of a case study approach is that even though in this data we're only looking at about 5 variables, we could actually examine many more factors and conditions by looking at these case studies and these cases individually, because we have the advantage of studying them in great detail. Eric says, the only case that these two differ is power sharing constitution. From this data, it shows that a power sharing constitution is most likely the cause of a successful democratic transition. Tyler says, I feel as if there are way too many other factors that play a part in this situation. However, if we were to draw a conclusion from this data, it appears that the cause of democratic transition is drawn by whether or not a country has a power sharing constitution. Again, absolutely, Tyler, it is true that we may be limited ultimately if we make a conclusion based on just this sample size. But again, I want to emphasize that based on this data and using the method to approach this data, we can draw that inference. And so, that might be an inference that you examine, you test in a larger body of evidence with more cases and more variables. But I do want to emphasize that at the beginning of the research process, you do need to draw this inference. And so even if you think that there are other factors, you've got to start somewhere. And so this is where we are right now. Karen says, given that the countries only differ in terms of power sharing, constitution, and democratic transition, we can see that one of the countries can be slightly more at an advantage. Daniela says, with the power sharing constitution, it allows for the different opposing groups to work in conjunction better, and that could be seen as a way for the transition to work. I see that we're really developing these ideas. Karen and Daniela and others are really thinking through the potential role for a power sharing constitution. They were both under French colonial rule, which would have a strong French cultural influence. Both retain low-income societies and are both ethnically diverse. Though when it comes down to all of this, it appears that having a power sharing constitution is essential to the success of a divided democracy, especially when resources are scarce and there are multiple languages, ethnicities, and religions. Power sharing allows for democracies to make decisions without leaving the entirety of an ethnicity out of the decision-making process. Very good, Martin, very good. You're really thinking theoretically about what could the potential role of such a power sharing regime be in promoting democracy. This is exactly what we want to do when we look at this data and we think about what could be going on systematically. Giovanni says, since a power sharing constitution is the only difference between their outcomes, it seems that the distribution of power among many veto players may complement the ethnic diversity by including all groups in government. This may lead to groups settling grievances through democratic means rather than by violence. Really good, Giovanni. That's excellent. You're thinking in terms of the mechanisms that could promote democratic transitions in the presence of power sharing. That's excellent. You're a step ahead of us, and I really appreciate you sharing your insight. Santiago says, from the information that we have, the only difference we see is that one country had a power sharing constitution while the other did not. Therefore, using the method of difference, we can test the hypothesis that a power sharing constitution leads to a country fully transitioning into a democracy. Daniela says, I apologize, I accidentally pressed enter too many times. No problem, Daniela, no problem. Thank you for your contribution. We really appreciate it. Don't worry about it. Yohel says, the lack of power sharing in Togo created room for unchecked activities, perhaps for autocratic tendencies. Though Benin has poverty and democracy, but democracy for whom? The external power sharing perhaps plays a role in the poverty created. Interesting ideas, Yohel. In thinking about power, democracy for whom? That's an interesting question because it gets us to thinking about, well, what's the quality of democracy in Benin? We'll deal with how we measure in conceptualize democracy soon, and that will get to what you're discussing in raising this issue. But for now, you are correct in pointing out that Togo is different than Benin in that regard, and that's important. Arturo says, if countries have a power-sharing constitution, they seem to have a democratic transition. My question would be, for what type of test is being implemented to test for a democracy? As yes, the elected officials may be from various parties, but the bureaucracy or the judicial court may only be from one. So Arturo, what we'll see is that we have a specific way of measuring democracy that relates to whether or not elections are free, fair, and frequent, and whether or not there are peaceful transfers of power from one government to another, in addition to some other characteristics that we include in our definition in our measure. But you'll see shortly in the next weeks that we do have a specific way of measuring it. And for now, we're going to focus on the primary difference between Benin and Togo in the way in which elections and leadership selection in those two countries were not the same in terms of the freeness, the fairness, and the frequency of those decisions. This is what it's going to ultimately come down to and what we're focusing on here. So what I want to focus on is what you've all pointed out, which is that the key differentiating factor is the presence or absence of a power-sharing constitution. And in a moment, we'll talk about what that means. But first, let's focus on the simple difference and the simple inference that we can draw from this difference. Benin and Togo differ in only one regard, and that is in the presence or the absence of such a constitution. Benin had one of these constitutions, and Togo did not. And this suggests that power-sharing constitutions indeed facilitate transitions. Now, many of you have pointed out, it's a small sample size, and we have a limited number of factors. Is it possible for us to truly draw a causal inference? What you're picking out is the strength of the sample and how valid this result might be based on the size of the sample. The inference itself can still be drawn from this data, putting aside the question of how valid and how far in general the outcome that we observe might be. In this data, what we can say is that a causal inference that can be drawn is that a power-sharing constitution causes a transition. We can draw that inference from this data, putting aside the question of the validity of that inference in a larger data set. So we do then draw the conclusion from this, we draw the inference that power-sharing constitutions facilitate democratic transitions in deeply divided societies. And the question then becomes, well, what actually happened in Benin and Togo? What was the nature of the power sharing that did or did not take place? And how did this process contribute to democracy? This is the key question that we must ask ourselves after we observe this simple difference in the data. And so for those of you who may question whether we can draw this causal inference, consider the following. In the 1990s, Benin adopted a new constitution that created formal institutional rules that gave political elites from different ethnic groups a shared stake in decision-making. And the key institution that they created was a unicameral legislature with 64 seats that allocated those seats by proportional representation in 6 multi-member constituencies that represented the 6 administrative units of the country. And what this did is it drew leaders from all of the rival communities, and it gave representation to minorities through proportional representation. And this drawing of leaders from different communities and this minority representation contributed to very moderate and cooperative behavior between groups. And this moderate cooperative behavior helped to contain intergroup tensions that otherwise may have persisted between those groups. And as these tensions were contained, and as these groups increasingly turned to cooperative, moderate behavior because of the institutional rules that brought them together in sharing power, free and fair elections and peaceful transfers of power became the norm in Benin. And it was through this process, this kind of solidification of these institutions and this sharing of power and this moderate cooperative behavior that free and fair elections became solidified and became an institutionalized feature of politics in Benin. Now, recently in Benin, we know that the country has actually seen a reversal and a return to autocracy. But up until the 2000s, Benin was an example of a successful transition to democracy. And what we largely know, or what we tend to agree in the literature, is that this was largely due to the power sharing constitution that was able to bring it together the various elites from different groups. Power sharing in Benin appears to have been very, very important. Now let's take a look at Togo, and you'll see a very different situation. Now in the 1990s in Togo, they also adopted a new constitution that created institutions, but these institutions created by this new constitution were very, very different. These institutions concentrated power in the hands of dominant groups, and this set of institutions included a legislature that allocated seats by majoritarian rule. What this meant was that parties only got seats if they won a majority in a given district, and that meant in turn that minority groups were not represented. And what this meant in turn was that minorities did not have channels and means of participating in accessing politics so as to address their grievances or sort out differences or negotiate politics or policies that would affect them adversely or beneficially. And so what we saw is that these groups, unable to access politics, became afraid of what would happen if they did not control the state. And they began to resort to undemocratic means as a result. As groups increasingly resorted to undemocratic means, it led to a situation where executive abuses in the concentration of power in the hands of the executive became a frequent practice in politics in response to the conflicts and the tensions between the groups who either found themselves on the inside or on the outside of these democratic or these political institutions. And so whereas in Benin, we saw the sharing of power through institutions, in Togo, we saw the concentration of power in dominant groups through institutions. And these different kinds of institutions and the different types of power dispersion or concentrating that took place meant that democratization occurred in Benin, but not in Togo. And so this helps us to understand how power sharing becomes consequential on a mechanistic level. How is it that power sharing, the presence or the absence of power sharing, led to or did not lead to a democratic transition? This is how. So this helps us to understand theoretically and analytically how this happened. But let's now focus on a different example, and that is the example of South Korea and democratization in South Korea. Now, our outcome of interest is a democratic transition, and our cases are South Korea and North Korea. And again, we're using the method of difference. Now, in this example, we're going to focus on 4 key characteristics of a country, 4 hypotheses, more or less, that help to explain or can potentially explain democratization in South Korea, but not in North Korea. And those are economic development, geography, nation formation, and post-World War II ideology. Economic development, geography, nation formation, and post-World War II ideology. What we'll do is we'll examine these variables in all our cases, South Korea, North Korea, and we'll take a look at what factor differentiates these similar cases and may help to explain why South Korea transitioned to democracy, but North Korea did not. So let's take a look at our formal hypotheses, focusing on economic development. Remember that this is our key hypothesis and the factor that we're choosing to focus on in this example, this analysis. And if we articulate that hypothesis, if it's true that development and democratization are related, then we should find that where economic development has occurred, attempted regime transitions will succeed in generating effective and lasting democratic states. To put it more simply, If a country is developed economically, it will be a democracy, period. The other side of the hypothesis is the flip side. Where economic development is delayed or has not taken place, autocracies will persist unreformed. To put it simply, where countries are not economically developed, democracy will not emerge. Autocracy will persist unreformed. Straightforward, testable, falsifiable. We can look at the data and find out if it's true that developed countries are democratic and underdeveloped countries are not democratic. So let's take a look at that data. We've got our method of difference, and we've got the comparison of similar cases across 5 variables, including our outcome, democratic transition. And we've got economic development, we've got geography, nation formation, and post-World War II ideology. Now we ask, in what ways do these cases differ? What differentiates these similar cases? And then similarly, what descriptive and causal inferences can we draw from this data? So like before, I'm going to pause and I'm going to put it to you. And I want you to evaluate this data, compare the similar cases, and ask, in what way do these cases differ? And then what inferences can we draw from the data? All right, we've got some early contributions picking up on a pattern that we see in the data. Multiple people appear to be on the same page here. Yeah, and that's a very good point made by both Daniela and Ishan as well. It's not possible to maybe know which factor might be more important in the factors that emerge as relevant here, but there are 2 factors that appear to be important to the outcome. And I'll say more about this here in a moment. But this is an important thing to pick up, that we're limited by the cases. Good, good. We're seeing a lot of consistency here, and I'm happy to see that everyone is responding to everyone else and kind of responding to the ideas that you have. We're all on the same page, and I'm happy that you're working together to develop your ideas.
Oh, that's good morning. Okay, I see. Cool. He's yawning.
So what we're seeing is that we can one inference that we can draw is that high levels of economic development seem to cause democratic transitions, but we also see that a liberal or statist ideology, kind of a fusion of those two, might also support a democratic transition, because South Korea had those two characteristics, but North Korea did not, although North Korea had all the other characteristics that South Korea had. So in North Korea, there was a low level of economic development, and it was a communist post-World War II ideology. It appears that there might be a relationship between these variables according to this data. Now, again, I want to emphasize very small sample size. We're simply trying to test hypotheses and figure out if there's an expected relationship between variables. But again, a lot of continuity here. I'm happy that you're all more or less on the same page and that you're in agreement with one another. Good, good. So we're seeing then that there's some interesting sort of role for ideology as well as development. And what I want to point out here is that this kind of contradicts our hypothesis. Remember that our hypothesis focused on economic development exclusively, but it appears that in the data, it's hard to rule out a role for ideology in how different ideas held by the governments in these countries might have promoted a democratic transition in one place, but not in the other. And so this is interesting because it complicates our picture, and it forces us to pause and think about how there may be more going on than just economic development and processes of socioeconomic modernization. South Korea and North Korea differ in both development and ideology, then, is our point. And this suggests that economic development and a liberal statist ideology may combine to cause a democratic transition. And that is an interesting take because it, again, forces us to reevaluate the original hypothesis. On the other hand, North Korea became an authoritarian state due to low development, dependence of state in the communism regime. Good, Joel. So you're picking out another inference that hasn't really been drawn. On the other hand, North Korea did not democratize because of the absence of development and because of the persistence of a communist ideology. Good, very, very good. So this does suggest then that development and ideology may both be at work in shaping the outcome. And you might be asking, in this case as well as in the African cases, what's actually happening behind the scenes here, behind the data? What process took place in South Korea that did not take place in North Korea? Let's take a look at the actual cases themselves and consider these processes so that we can better understand development and how it might be at play. In the 1960s and 70s in South Korea, the military government pursued a state-led economic development strategy that spurred rapid, sustained economic growth. Basically what they did is they were heavily involved in coordinating the activities of the private sector. There would be a heavy role for the state, but there'd be a role for the private sector in providing the initiative, sources of finance, often with the support of the state, but the initiative primarily. This was an example of a statist kind of liberal approach to economic development because of the emphasis on private sector activity, but state involvement. Now, this economic development strategy that produced rapid growth also transformed the society itself. And the middle class grew to a great size, and literacy rates increased dramatically, as did education levels, all as a result of the economic miracle that took place in response to this development strategy pursued by the military government. Now, this process of socioeconomic modernization gave force to huge protests and movements among students and other groups in society who protested the continuation of the authoritarian regime and eventually helped to bring about the first democratic elections in June 1987. This is the development process in South Korea. This is what we refer to as socioeconomic modernization. This is a process that transformed society and transformed politics in South Korea. And this is the process that we're sort of hypothesizing and that we're testing out in South Korea and that we're not seeing in North Korea. Now, what happened in North Korea? What happened in North Korea was really the opposite. So no process of modernization took place in North Korea, and development was not pursued in any similar way. In fact, in the 70s and the 80s, the economy crumbled with the fall of communism, reforms in China, the death in '94 of the great leader. In December 1993, North Korea did pursue a policy stressing some industrialization, but they could never access the inputs that they needed to actually industrialize and promote the kind of processes that would lead to the development that could transform society. And so as a result, modernization never took place in North Korea, and the economy remains an agricultural economy. Literacy rates remain very low. Education levels remain low by comparison. And we can say with certitude that no process of modernization took place in North Korea like it took place in South Korea. And in fact, North Korea remains the world's last Stalinist dictatorship, really a brutal place where people starve from famines and where the totalitarian regime remains in absolute control. The outcome couldn't be any different than the outcome in South Korea, an outcome of democracy versus an outcome of dictatorship. And so this is how we can help to explain the North Korean case by reference to delayed development. In this case, it's not a question of economic development, it's a question of economic underdevelopment. And so this helps us to see how we can analyze the cases using the same variable. Of course, there's a role for ideology as well, and you see that in these cases, the regimes themselves, the authoritarian regimes themselves, largely had different ideologies. In North Korea, it was a communist, Stalinist ideology. In South Korea, it was a sort of a more liberal kind of statist, even almost progressive ideology in some way. Now, let's shift gears and deal with the second method for testing hypotheses. And this is the method of agreement. And this is the method for comparing different cases. Now, we're shifting gears here and focusing on different patterns of similarity and difference than what we use with method of difference. With method of agreement, we're talking about sets of very different cases where the outcome does not vary. That is to say, very different countries with the same outcome. And the steps involved here are as follows. First, we identify the outcome that is to be explained, and then we pick out the factor that these different cases have in common, and then we attribute the shared outcome to that common factor. Now, this is a process in identifying what unifies different cases. What is it that's unifying those cases and that might account for their similar shared outcome? Let's give an example and evaluate some data using this method. And we're going to compare South Korea and Argentina. Now, these are very different cases. They're very different economically, historically, socially, culturally, geographically, politically. In virtually every way, South Korea and Argentina are distinct, but they both experienced a democratic transition around the same time in the 1980s. And because they both experienced that transition, we can use the method of agreement to identify a factor that these two cases have in common. And that factor that they have in common might help to explain the shared outcome. And so what we're focusing on are four characteristics. It should say three. Sorry about that, everyone. Three characteristics of a country: economic development, geography, and post-World War II ideology. These are factors that are the same as the factors that we looked at with our method of difference. Here we're using the method of agreement, and we're finding out if they also play out as expected in South Korea and Argentina when we compare these two countries. And so let's look at the data. And we've got the values on our different variables for our two cases. We've got economic development, geography, and post-World War II ideology, and then of course the outcome, democratic transition. They have the same outcome, and we're asking, what do these cases have in common? What do these different cases have in common? We're comparing different cases and looking for what unifies the cases and might explain the outcome. And then ultimately, we want to draw inferences from this data, descriptive and causal inferences about what causes democratic transitions. And so I want to put it to you right now to use the method of agreement to evaluate this data and then share with the class your result. And I look forward to incorporating your input here in a few minutes when I begin to review that input. So let us know in the chat. Ishan says, these cases have the economic development in common, which strengthens the case of economic development and democratic transitions. Okay. Gustavo says, these show that economic development, actual democratic transition, and post-World War II ideology are very common amongst these two countries, and is the reason why they both had a good transition around this time. We can also infer that region or geography does not matter based on this data. Okay. Daniela says, the strong economic development could help with a better democratic transition, and it can also help out with other factors that can make it easier, such as influencing different political ideologies in a nation. Okay. Juan says, these two countries had at the same time a high economic development, which allowed for a transition into democracy. Therefore, it didn't matter that it was declining since they were still at a high level. Good point, Juan. Good point. Daniela says, also geography doesn't matter. Might be an obvious one, but worth noting. It is worth noting, Daniela. That's super important because it means that like there might not be regional diffusion factors that play a role. If it appears that distant places had the same outcome, we can rule out some of those international or even geographical factors that we might think have something to do with the outcome. And so, yeah, absolutely. That might seem obvious, but it is worth noting. And so I'm glad that you did. Arturo says, the USA opened South Korea's economy to the world with its backing. International investors trusted countries where the US had a strong political presence more than those where they did not. A strong economy could lead to possibly a stronger democracy. Where those such as Argentina with a weaker economy, the democracy is weakening since people are unhappy and grifters can take the role of political elites promising to make things better when they get into office only to turn around and do the opposite. Okay, so there's a lot there, but Arturo certainly has a good point in emphasizing that South Korea had international partners in some sense. There was support on behalf of there was support for democratic transition in South Korea by the United States, and the opening of the economy, the process of economic liberalization that took place in South Korea was related to democratization. So that certainly is relevant, and it's good that you mentioned it, Arturo. Joel says, though the Argentina and South Korea may seem different, the outcome was a product of a healthy economic development and liberal and statist ideologies in the citizens. These both weaken the case for economic development alone as the only factor for democratization. Good, Joel. So Joel's pointing out that because there may be a role for ideology as well, it may actually weaken the role for economic development if there's some reason that ideology is at play here in causing that democratic transition. If there really is a role for ideology, it seems that development may not be the full story. Daniela says, however, there could be an argument made for Argentina that they might end up detransitioning soon due to the butt declining. Yeah, good point, Daniela. As Ishan mentioned, economic development being high helps with democratic transitions, as seen in the cases presented, but with a decline, it could influence other political movements, which can influence a democratic transition. Yeah, detransition. Good, Daniela. So this is something that I was hoping someone would pick up on, which is that the direction of development, even if the level is still relatively high, might have some impact on the process. And I think that it's important to note that Argentina was, in some sense, de-developing at the time because of the sorry condition of the economy under the control of the military regime at the time. Karen says both places have high economic development, which may be the indication for democratic transition. However, Argentina's economic development is declining, and they aren't classified as liberal like South Korea. Okay, good, Karen, good. So this is an interesting set of data here because as some of us are pointing out, it's not as simple as just a story about economic development. In fact, there appears to be some role potentially for ideology in how it might promote a transition in some way that might not appear in this data, but that could be important. It is true that Argentina and South Korea both are relatively economically developed. Argentina, however, is in decline at this time economically. And what's interesting is that if we think about that as important, it could draw into doubt the role for economic development, and it might suggest that there's a more important role for post-World War II ideology. And so in the final analysis, this data might not strengthen the case for economic development. And the reason I pose this and put this to you is because this problematizes one of the most important theories and hypotheses of all in democratization research, which is that economic development causes democratization. And we'll see later on in the course that the data is far more spotty and nuanced than maybe the consensus around this variable would suggest. In fact, some of the most developed countries are not democratic at all, and some quite democratic countries are not very developed at all. And so this data helps us begin to see that in reality, the situation might be more complicated than a simple sort of relationship between development and democracy. And it's good that you're picking this out, you all, but it's also good that you're seeing that there's a consistency between the cases in economic development, because there largely is. And so we can see these two cases from a couple different perspectives according to the different values that they have. And our understanding of economic development as a key cause may be affected by this data. I'm going to add a few more comments here. Both have high levels of economic development and similar status ideologies, which led to a successful democratic transition. Comparing the two strengthens the case for economic development, because we saw in South Korea, the government economic policy led to increased literacy and a wealthier, larger middle class that demanded democratic reforms. Good, Giovanni. A similar process may have taken place in Argentina, and I can tell you that it did. The statist ideology also meant that governmental interventions were legitimate. Good, good. That's an interesting set of arguments. I think you're right on. Arturo says, it could also be the geography, looking at the countries neighboring Argentina and their democracy compared to the neighboring countries of South Korea, including the interests of international organizations. Potentially, Arturo, potentially. Okay, everyone, it is now the end of class, and I'm very, very happy with our discussion in our lecture today. We dove into some challenging issues. We're talking about methods and using methods to evaluate data and draw inferences about what causes democratic transitions. This is what we want to do in this course. And in the remainder of the course, we'll use these methods to analyze data and to test hypotheses that come from the various theoretical frameworks that we use to analyze democratic transitions. So we've now begun to analyze data, and you're now using methods to analyze data in a way that you'll do in your own work for this class. So I thank you very much for your contributions. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. You're free to go if you have no comments or questions that you'd like to ask me, but I will stick around for a few minutes and take questions via the chat or via the microphone if you choose to hang around and talk with me. Thanks again, everyone, and I'll see you next week.